Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're going exploring how James Joyce's idea of exile shaped the way he wrote about cities.
Exile is such a fascinating concept.
Right, and when you think about Joyce Dublin, probably comes to mind first.
Of course.
But get this, his time in exile, especially in Trieste, it actually became like this hidden layer in his writing about Dublin.
Almost like a secret code.
Exactly. So to help us unpack all this, I'm joined by experts' credentials and title welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get into Trieste, let's start with Joyce himself.
Okay.
He was really known for blurring the lines between his life and his art.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to draw on his own experiences, especially that whole self-imposed exile from Ireland thing.
Right, like how much of that is in his work?
I think a lot. There's this great quote by Helene Sixus who said that for Joyce, life and art are consubstantial.
Wow.
They're basically made of the same stuff.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that makes you look at all those little details in his writing in a whole new light.
Right, like how much of him is hidden in there.
Exactly. But let's talk more about this whole exile thing.
Sure.
Because it seems pretty central to understanding his point of view.
Definitely. Edward Said, who studied the experience of exile, described it as a contrapuntal existence.
Meaning,
You're constantly comparing your old life to your new one.
never quite feeling settled in either place.
Right. You're always in between.
So it's like living in two worlds at once, never really belonging to either one.
yeah,
I could see how that would affect the way you see things and how you write.
totally.
So where does Trieste fit into all of this?
Think of Trieste in Giacomo Joyce as a palimpsest.
A what now?
A palimpsest. You know those old manuscripts where you can kind of see the original writing underneath a newer layer?
Okay, yeah.
Well, Joyce does something similar. He takes details from Trieste and incorporates them into the text as if he's like layering them onto memories of Dublin.
Okay, so he's not just writing about different cities.
Right.
He's using his experiences in one city, Trieste, to reshape how he portrays another city, Dublin. So each city becomes a layer in this creative process.
I like that. A layer in the creative process. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And it helps us understand why his version of Dublin is so unique.
Yeah, totally. So when you're reading Ulysses and you come across those descriptions of Dublin, there's this whole other layer of Trieste underneath.
Adding another dimension to the city.
That's incredible. It's like Dublin isn't just a literal place anymore. It's this kind of composite creation built on all these layers of memory and experience.
Exactly.
Okay, but to get a real sense of this, can we look at some specifics? Like what kind of details did he actually pull from Trieste?
Well, for starters, he uses actual street names like Via San Michele.
Oh, wow.
Immediately, you're transported to Trieste just by reading those words.
Right.
He also mentions landmarks like Ulysses' house,
Okay,
which belonged to this prominent Greek family who were pro-Austrian.
interesting.
It reflects that kind of complex political situation in Trieste at the time.
Oh, that's cool.
And even his own Shakespeare lectures, which he gave at the Universitato Popolo, they pop up too.
So he's really grounding his writing in the actual sights and sounds of Trieste.
Yeah, weaving them right into the narrative.
But there was also something about an Oriental element in his portrayal of Trieste, right?
Yes, you're right.
That seems a bit unexpected.
It is. He uses imagery like the Grand Turk and his harem, which evokes this sense of the exotic and foreign.
Okay.
And here's a really interesting detail. He also references this old Irish song called Cafuzilum.
Kafuzivla.
Yeah, it's set in the East and tells the story of forbidden love with a pretty tragic ending.
Oh, yeah, I think I've heard that one. Isn't it about a soldier and a local woman?
That's the one. But why bring that into his depiction of Trieste?
What's the connection?
Well, there are a couple of things going on. First, Trieste was known as La Porta d'Orient, Austria's gateway to the East.
Okay.
It was a real melting pot of cultures, and that sense of the exotic was everywhere. Second, both Giacomo Joyce and Cafuzilum deal with these themes of forbidden love and longing.
Oh, I see. So there's like a thematic link there, too.
Exactly. It adds another layer to this whole palimpsest idea.
Wow, it's like he's using these seemingly random details to create this web of interconnected meanings.
Like a puzzle.
It makes you want to reread his work with fresh eyes.
Exactly. There's always more to discover with Joyce.
But let's think about this whole exile thing for a minute.
Okay.
Living in between worlds like that, it must have created a sense of instability, of not quite belonging.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've moved cities before, and even that can be disorienting.
Totally.
But to be in self-imposed exile, always comparing yourself to the place you left behind.
It definitely shapes your worldview.
Totally. So how did that impact Joyce's perspective?
Well, he was what you might call an Italianized Irishman caught between cultures.
Right.
And there's this line in Giacomo Joyce that captures this perfectly. He writes, "They love their country when they are quite sure which country it is."
Wow, there's a lot packed into that sentence.
Right, like a mix of humor and sadness.
It's like he's poking fun at the whole idea of national identity while also feeling the sting of not quite belonging.
Exactly. And I think we've all felt that at some point, that uncertainty about where we fit in.
For sure. But for Joyce, in exile, it must have been really intense.
Definitely, he poured that feeling into his writing, and it gave him this really unique perspective on cities and belonging.
It's like he was constantly searching for home, but maybe home wasn't a place, but a feeling or an idea.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And what's interesting is how this instability and layered identity shows up in his later work, like in Ulysses.
Okay.
There's a scene that originally appeared in Giacomo Joyce,
Uh-huh.
which was set in Trieste, but in Ulysses, that same scene is suddenly in Paris.
He just like picked it up and moved it.
He essentially took the core elements, stripped away the Trieste specifics, and rewrote it with Parisian details.
Wow, so he's like recycling his own writing, repurposing these scenes and experiences to create something new.
And it highlights how Trieste became a textual building block for his Dublin.
Oh, that's so interesting. Like he was using Trieste as a model or a blueprint.
In a way, yeah, and it makes you think about that famous ending of Ulysses.
With the giant dot.
Yes, that dot answering the question, where?
It's such a cliffhanger. What do you think it means?
Well, some scholars argue that the real location is inside the text itself.
Oh, wow.
Joyce's Dublin is built not just on Irish reality, but also on layers of these other cities he experienced, including Trieste.
So to really get Joyce's Dublin,
You have to look beyond the surface and consider all those hidden influences.
this is blowing my mind. It's like we've been given a secret decoder ring for Joyce's writing.
Exactly. And now that we've started to crack the code, it opens up a whole new way of reading and interpreting his work.
It makes you wonder what other cities might be hidden in his books waiting to be discovered.
Right. What other layers are there?
But before we get too lost in those layers,
Right.
let's zoom back in on Trieste itself.
Okay.
What was so special about this city that it had such a big impact on Joyce?
That's a great question. And to answer it, we need to dive into Trieste's own history and culture.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
What made it such fertile ground for Joyce's imagination?
Well, imagine this, a city perched on the edge of the Adriatic Sea.
Okay.
A true melting pot of languages, traditions, and empires.
Wow.
A place where Italian, Slavic, and Germanic influences all swirled together, creating this really cosmopolitan atmosphere.
It sounds like a city buzzing with energy and ideas.
It was, and it was a city that embraced both the old and the new, where history and modernity kind of coexisted in this interesting tension.
And that tension, that feeling of being caught between worlds, it must have really resonated with Joyce's own experience of exile.
Absolutely. It was like looking in a mirror.
So Trieste wasn't just a place for Joyce.
Right.
It was this reflection of his own internal world.
A place where he could explore those feelings of displacement and belonging.
Wow, I'm starting to see Trieste in a whole new light.
Right.
It's not just a backdrop for Joyce's stories.
It's more than that.
It's like a character in its own right, a force that shaped his writing and worldview.
And that's what we'll be exploring as we continue our deep dive today.
Okay.
We're going to uncover how Trieste's history, culture, and literary scene influenced Joyce.
I can't wait. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to delve deeper into the world of Trieste.
Sounds good. So we've talked about how Trieste was this kind of hidden layer in Joyce's writing.
Right.
But let's flip the script for a second and look at Trieste's own literary scene. It wasn't just Joyce who found inspiration there.
Oh, yeah, that's true. What kind of literary scene was happening there when Joyce arrived?
Well, imagine this, a city where cafes are buzzing with intellectual debates, writers from all over crossing paths and multiple languages swirling in the air.
Sounds intense.
It was. Trieste was a real cultural crossroads, and its literary scene reflected that.
So did those conversations, those creative collisions, did they influence Joyce's writing in any way?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely possible. They were all breathing the same air, so to speak.
Makes sense. But before we get to Joyce, can you give us a sense of who some of the key players were in Trieste's literary world?
Well, one fascinating figure who actually became friends with Joyce was Italo Svevo.
Italo Svevo.
Yeah, he was kind of a Renaissance man, actually a businessman by day and a writer by night.
Wow, double life.
Exactly. And his writing really delved into these themes of identity alienation and the complexities of modern life, all with this sharp wit and irony.
Those themes definitely sound familiar.
Right, like something Joyce might be interested in.
Totally. It makes you wonder if their friendship, those conversations over coffee or whatever, did that shape their writing?
It's possible they were both keen observers of society outsiders in a way, and that shared perspective could have fueled their work.
Yeah, and what about Svevo's writing itself? What was he known for?
He was great at capturing the anxieties and aspirations of Trieste's middle class, reflecting the city's social and economic landscape.
So he was writing about real people, real lives.
Exactly. His most famous novel, Confessions of Zeno, it's a masterpiece of modernist literature.
What's it about?
It's about this guy, Zeno Cucini, who's trying to understand his life through psychoanalysis.
Okay.
But he's totally unreliable as a narrator. You never know if you can trust what he's saying.
Oh, I love unreliable narrators. They always keep you guessing.
Me too. And Svevo was brilliant at capturing that sense of uncertainty that we all feel sometimes, that self-deception.
Totally. And his work reflects the whole cultural mix of Trieste, right?
Absolutely, blending Italian literary traditions with influences from Central Europe.
So Svevo was writing in Italian, but with this unique Triestine perspective.
Exactly. But Italian wasn't the only language in play. Trieste also had this vibrant Slovenian literary scene.
Oh, wow.
With authors like Sricha Kosovel and Igo Grudin exploring themes of national identity and social justice.
It's amazing how this one city had all these different languages and cultures all mixing together. It makes you realize how interconnected literature is.
It really does. Literature doesn't care about borders. It flows across them just like the people who create it.
So we've got Italian and Slovenian voices, but I'm guessing there was also a strong Germanic influence, given Trieste's history as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
You got it. Authors like Rainer Maria Rilke were drawn to Trieste's beauty and its unique position between cultures.
Wait, Rilke, the guy who wrote the Duino Elegies.
Yeah.
He spent time in Trieste.
He did. He was a guest of Princess Marie von Thurn in Taxes at her castle near Trieste Duino Castle.
I see.
And it was during his time there that he started writing the Duino Elegies inspired by the landscape and the sea.
Wow, so Trieste was like this creative magnet drawing in writers from all over.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just famous authors either. Trieste had this whole cafe culture where young writers, poets, intellectuals had all gathered to share ideas and debate the issues of the day.
Like a literary salon.
Exactly, a real hotbed of creativity.
So we've talked about how Joyce might have been influenced by all this, but what about the other way around? Did he leave any kind of literary legacy in Trieste?
It's hard to pinpoint a direct influence, but his presence definitely added to the city's cosmopolitan vibe, its reputation as a hub for creative types.
Right, makes sense. So maybe there are these subtle echoes of Joyce in the work of other Triestine writers, even if they weren't directly influenced by him.
It's possible. But to really explore that, we need to move beyond individual writers and look at the broader literary trends in Trieste.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. What were some of the big ideas or the recurring themes that might connect Joyce to the broader literary scene in Trieste?
Well, one major trend was the rise of modernism, which was happening all over Europe at the time. But in Trieste, it had a unique flavor shaped by the city's multicultural mix.
So Triestine writers were pushing boundaries, breaking the rules.
Absolutely. They were exploring new ways of telling stories, experimenting with stream of consciousness, fragmented narratives, ambiguous endings, all to reflect the complexities of modern life.
It sounds like they were trying to capture that same feeling of instability and fragmentation that we talked about earlier.
Right, that sense of living between worlds, which resonated so deeply with Joyce.
So even if they weren't directly copying Joyce, there was this shared cultural climate, a common set of concerns that shaped their writing.
It's like they were all swimming in the same creative waters.
Love that analogy. But modernism was a pretty broad movement. Were there any specific themes or motifs that popped up in both Joyce's work and the writing of other Triestine authors?
One big one was identity, especially the tension between individual and collective identities.
Makes sense. Trieste was this melting pot of different national and ethnic groups.
Exactly. So characters in Triestine literature were often wrestling with these questions of belonging. Where do I fit in? Who am I in this mix of cultures?
And we see those same questions in Joyce's work, too.
Absolutely. Like with Leopold Bloom and Ulysses constantly navigating his Jewish identity within Irish society.
It's fascinating how these themes transcend borders and time. They speak to a universal human experience.
They do. And literature helps us understand those shared experiences, even if the specific contexts are different. But beyond identity, another key theme was the impact of modernization on urban life.
Right. Trieste was undergoing a lot of changes at the turn of the century.
It was. Industrialization, new technologies, shifting social norms.
All of that must have created a sense of excitement, but also anxiety.
Definitely. And writers were trying to capture that energy, that vibrancy, but also the darkness of this urban transformation.
So what kind of themes were they exploring?
Things like alienation, isolation, the breakdown of traditional values, all set against this backdrop of a city in constant motion.
It's like a literary version of those early city symphony films.
Yes, capturing the sights and sounds of the modern city.
Both the beautiful and the ugly.
Exactly. And just like those films, Triestine literature and Joyce's work offered this kaleidoscopic view of the city.
With all its contradictions and complexities.
Precisely. Okay, so we've got the themes, but what about style? Were Triestine writers experimenting with language and form in similar ways to Joyce?
That's a great question.
Well, there was definitely a shared emphasis on psychological realism.
Okay.
Delving into the inner lives of characters, exploring their thoughts and feelings in a very raw and immediate way.
And that often meant breaking away from traditional storytelling.
Yeah, exactly. Using techniques like stream of consciousness to capture the flow of thought.
So were they directly borrowing from Joyce or arriving at similar approaches independently?
It's tough to say. Influence can be very subtle. But there was definitely a shared sense of innovation, a willingness to experiment and push boundaries.
To capture that modern experience.
Exactly. And that shared spirit created this incredibly vibrant and diverse literary scene in Trieste, one that reflected and maybe even resonated with Joyce's own artistic vision.
But Trieste wasn't just about modernism, right? There were other literary currents flowing through the city.
Absolutely. Modernism was dominant, but not exclusive. You also see influences from expressionism, symbolism, even futurism.
So many isms.
It was an eclectic mix, which is what made Trieste so unique.
It's like the city's literary scene was as diverse as its cultural landscape.
Exactly. It defies easy categorization.
Okay, so we've talked about themes and trends, but can we get even more specific? Are there any works by Triestine authors that really capture that shared energy, those echoes of Joyce, even if they weren't directly influenced by him?
That's a great challenge, and it's what we love to do here on the Deep Dive, uncovering those hidden connections.
I'm ready to play literary detective. Where do we start?
Let's start with a work by Italo Svevo that has some interesting parallels to Joyce's themes. It's a short story called The Hoax.
The Hoax, okay.
And it really delves into identity, self-deception, and the power of language.
Sounds intriguing. What's it about?
It's about this guy, Mario, who creates a fake persona to impress people. He makes up this elaborate backstory full of travels and literary achievements.
It's like he's building his own personal palimpsest.
I love that. Layering this fake identity on top of his real one.
Yeah.
And as the story goes on, this fake identity starts to take over, blurring the lines between reality and illusion. It makes both Mario and the reader question what's real and what's not.
So it's a story about mistaken identity, but with this psychological twist.
Exactly. And it raises questions about the nature of self, the masks we wear, the stories we tell ourselves and others.
All themes that we see in Joyce.
Absolutely. So even if Svevo wasn't directly inspired by Joyce in this story, there's a shared sensibility, a common exploration of human psychology.
Okay, so we've got Svevo, but what about other Triestine authors? Any hidden gems we should check out?
There's a great novel by Scipio Slatoper called My Karst.
My Karst, that title sounds so evocative. What's it about?
It's semi-autobiographical and explores themes of national identity, cultural belonging, and searching for meaning in a changing world.
My Karst. It's like the land itself is part of his identity.
Exactly. And the protagonist, who's also named Scipio, he's this young man from Trieste who's torn between his Italian and Slavic heritage.
That feeling of being caught between cultures, we've seen that before.
It's a recurring theme in Triestine literature. It reflects the city's identity as this border town, a place where cultures collide.
So how does Scipio deal with this inner conflict?
He goes on this journey, a physical and spiritual journey through the Karst region.
The Karst.
Yeah, it's this rugged landscape that straddles the border between Italy and Slovenia.
So the landscape becomes like a metaphor for his own internal struggles.
Exactly. And as he travels, he meets all these different characters who represent different parts of himself.
Wow, so it's a classic journey of self-discovery.
It is. And along the way, he grapples with questions of language culture and the meaning of home, trying to find a place where he truly belongs.
It's a story that resonates with anyone who's ever felt like an outsider.
Definitely. And it's deeply rooted in the unique cultural landscape of Trieste.
Okay, so we've got Svevo exploring identity and Slatoper on this journey of self-discovery. Are there any other Triestine authors we should add to our list?
There's one more I want to mention, and it might surprise you. Umberto Saba, a poet.
A poet. I thought we were talking about novels and short stories.
Poetry is just as important. And Saba's poetry offers a really unique perspective on Trieste.
Okay, I'm listening. What's so special about Saba's poetry?
He had this amazing ability to capture the everyday details of life in the city, the sights, the sounds, the emotions.
Like a literary photographer?
Yeah. He wrote about the cafes, the streets, the people of Trieste with such tenderness and attention.
So he was finding poetry in the mundane.
Exactly.
Sure.
And his poetry reflects this intimate connection with the city. He was a part of it, but also an observer.
Like he was taking the pulse of Trieste.
That's a great way to put it. And his poetry also explores those big themes. Love, lost memory, the search for meaning.
Deep stuff.
It is. But his style was so simple, yet powerful. He used everyday language, but beneath that simplicity was this depth of emotion.
It's like he was finding the extraordinary in the ordinary.
And that reminds me of Joyce's own attention to detail, that ability to see beauty and meaning in the smallest moments.
So even though Saba wasn't a modernist in the same way as Joyce or Svevo, there's this shared focus on the human experience.
Absolutely. And that's what makes exploring Trieste's literary scenes so rewarding. You see how different writers with different styles found inspiration in the same city?
It's like they were all adding their own brushstrokes to this portrait of Trieste.
And that portrait keeps evolving. Contemporary Triestine authors like Boris Pehor and Susanna Tomaro are building on that legacy, exploring new themes and finding new ways to capture the city's identity.
So Trieste's literary scene is still thriving, still evolving.
It is. But how has the city itself dealt with its own identity, especially after Joyce left?
That's a good question. What were some of the big turning points that shaped Trieste's identity after Joyce?
Well, one of the most significant events was the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I.
Right. Trieste had been part of that empire for so long.
Exactly. And suddenly it found itself part of Italy.
Wow, that must have been a huge adjustment for everyone.
It was. Some people embraced it, but others felt a sense of loss and uncertainty.
Like their world had been turned upside down.
In a way, it had. And those tensions were only heightened by the rise of fascism in Italy.
Oh, right.
Trieste, with its diverse population and history, became a target of these attempts to impose a unified Italian identity.
It's a reminder that even cities with a strong tradition of tolerance can be vulnerable to these forces of nationalism and exclusion.
It's a dark part of history, but it's important to remember.
So how did Trieste make it through this period?
It was a difficult time. Many people resisted fascism, but there was also a lot of hardship. But what's incredible is that the city's spirit of resilience and its deep-seated multiculturalism, they survived.
It speaks to the power of art and literature to challenge those dominant narratives and preserve cultural memory.
Definitely. So after World War II, did things settle down for Trieste?
That's what I'm wondering.
Well, the post-war period brought its own set of challenges. Trieste became the center of a territorial dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia.
Oh no, so the city was caught in another tug of war.
It was, but this time between two nation-states. And it created a lot of political uncertainty and tension.
So how did they resolve it?
It took a lot of diplomacy and compromise, but ultimately it was Trieste's history of multiculturalism, its ability to accommodate different perspectives that helped it navigate this difficult period.
It's like that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right. And it's a reminder that diversity can be a source of strength, especially when it comes to resolving conflicts.
So Trieste eventually became part of Italy again, but did it lose its unique identity?
Not at all. You could argue that its identity as a border city, as this crossroads of cultures, has only become stronger.
It's like that palimpsest. Again, new layers are added, but the traces of the old ones are still there.
Exactly. And you can see that layering in the city's modern cultural scene. For example, Trieste has this amazing international literary festival that brings together authors from all over the world.
So it's like the city itself has become a celebration of literature and cultural exchange.
It has. And it's a fitting tribute to Joyce's legacy, his belief in the power of literature to bridge divides.
So after this deep dive into Trieste's history and literary world, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key thing to remember is that cities are living organisms. They're always evolving, shaped by the people and the stories they tell. And Trieste, with its rich and complex history, is a perfect example of that.
So it's not just about preserving the past.
Right.
It's about embracing the present and looking to the future.
Exactly. And that requires us to be open to complexity, to appreciate diversity, and to recognize that identity is a journey.
Trieste sounds like the perfect place to go on that journey.
It is. It's a city that invites you to explore, to question, to embrace the unknown.
It reminds us that the most interesting stories are often found at the edges, where cultures collide, and new possibilities are born.
Well said.
Okay, so we've explored how Trieste got kind of served as this secret layer in Joyce's writing, and how Trieste itself was this hub of literary activity. But it makes you wonder, how did the city's own identity evolve, especially after Joyce moved on?
It's really interesting because the city almost becomes like a character itself, constantly changing, shaped by history and culture. And one of the biggest turning points for Trieste was the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. Trieste had been this vital port city within the empire.
Right, for centuries.
Yeah, and then suddenly it's part of Italy.
That must have been a huge shock to the system for the people living there.
Absolutely. It was a mixed bag for sure. Some people, especially those who identified with Italian culture, saw it as a kind of homecoming.
A return to their roots.
Exactly. But for others, especially those who had done well under Habsburg rule, there was this sense of loss and uncertainty about what the future held.
So you have this underlying tension, this division within the city itself.
Definitely. And it kind of mirrors those themes of identity and belonging that we see in the literature.
Right, like everyone trying to figure out where they fit in.
Exactly. And these tensions, they only got worse with the rise of fascism in Italy during the 1920s and 30s. Well, Trieste, with its diverse population and its history of multiculturalism, it became a target of these fascist attempts to create a unified Italian identity.
It's scary how even cities known for their openness and tolerance can be swept up in these waves of nationalism.
It's a reminder that those forces can emerge anywhere, anytime.
So how did Trieste survive this period?
It was a really tough time. Many intellectuals and artists in Trieste resisted fascism, some of them paying a high price for their opposition.
It must have taken a lot of courage to stand up to that kind of pressure.
It did. But what's incredible is that the city's spirit of resilience and its deep-seated multiculturalism they endured.
It's like a testament to the human spirit.
Yeah.
That even in the darkest of times, there's this spark of hope that refuses to be extinguished.
It's inspiring. And it speaks to the power of art and literature to challenge those dominant narratives to keep those voices alive.
Okay, so World War II ends. Did things finally calm down for Trieste?
Well, not exactly. The post-war period brought a whole new set of challenges. Trieste became this focal point of a territorial dispute between Italy and Yugoslavia.
Oh, wow. So the city was caught in another tug-of-war.
It was. And this time, between two nation-states vying for control, it created a lot of uncertainty and tension.
So how did they manage to resolve this?
It took a lot of delicate diplomacy and a willingness to compromise from all sides. But ultimately, it was Trieste's history of multiculturalism, its ability to embrace different perspectives that helped it navigate this difficult period.
It's like that diversity, which had been a source of tension in the past, actually became its strength.
Exactly. It provided a foundation for understanding and cooperation. And it's a lesson that's still relevant today, as we grapple with issues of globalization and the need for more inclusive societies.
It's like Trieste's story is a reminder that embracing our differences can lead to greater resilience and understanding.
Well put.
So Trieste eventually did become part of Italy again. But in the process, did it lose that unique identity, that sense of being a crossroads?
I don't think so. In fact, you can argue that Trieste's identity as a border city, as a place where cultures intersect, has only become more pronounced in recent times.
It's like those layers we talked about before. New layers are added, but the traces of the old ones are still there, creating this rich and complex tapestry.
Exactly. And you see that layering in the city's cultural scene today. Like, Trieste has this fantastic international literary festival.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
It brings together authors from all over the world, celebrating the power of storytelling and language to connect people from different backgrounds.
It's like the city itself has become this embodiment of cultural exchange, a testament to the power of literature to bridge divides.
Beautifully said. And it's a fitting tribute to Joyce's legacy, his belief in the power of words to transcend borders and create connections.
So after this incredible journey through Trieste history and literary landscape, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
I think the most important takeaway is that cities are constantly evolving. They're shaped by the people who live in them and the stories they tell. And Trieste, with its rich and complex history, is a perfect example of that dynamism.
So it's not just about preserving the past.
Right.
It's about embracing the present and looking to the future with a sense of curiosity and possibility.
Exactly. And that requires a willingness to engage with complexity, to appreciate the beauty of diversity, and to understand that identity is a journey, not a destination.
Trieste sounds like the perfect place to embark on that kind of journey, a city that invites you to explore, to question, to embrace the unknown.
It is. It's a city that reminds us that the most interesting stories are often found at the edges where cultures collide and new possibilities are born.
Please go to finneganswakenotes.net for a full explanation of the text, and please don't forget to hit the like button.